The first speaker I like to invite is His Grace Mahatma Prabhu, Prabhupada disciple, initiating spiritual master, and an educator. And the talk that Prabhu will address today is on emotional and psychological education.
Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swami Ti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nirvisesa Sanyavadi Paschatya Dastarine. Before we begin, I would like to do something. If you are sitting in the same seat you were sitting before, move somewhere else, and you will get a new perspective. I learned this in Vrindavan in the 90s. From that devotee, Prana, that devotee from Singapore, he taught accelerated learning. Padmasambhava. Don't sit in the same seat you've been sitting in. Sit in a new seat. It'll activate your brain. You'll have a new perspective. Did you know that? Because a lot of times in my workshops, when we take breaks, I don't let people sit in the same seat. It actually helps. And something I learned from professionals, that the energy is higher in the front than it is in the back. So it's interesting because something may be very interesting to you in the front, and if you're in the back, it sounds boring because the energy is lower. Did you know that? And that's why John Lennon said, when you play, play to the back, because there's very little energy. So that's good for speakers, but if you want more energy, it's up here. Okay, so the reason I am on the stage today is because it's the fault of Chetan. Chetan, can you stand up? Chetan is helping organize this, and Chetan took my forgiveness workshop, and he was very moved by it and felt that it would be useful, maybe important, or maybe even necessary, that you'll have to decide, that I would speak about my experience with the training that I personally went through and the training that I give to devotees around developing emotional and psychological, you could say intelligence, maturity, knowledge, and intelligence. So what I decided to do was to just kind of tell you my story, how I fell into this. You may have heard the story when one devotee said, Prabhupada, sometimes I fall into Maya. And Prabhupada said, you're always in Maya, sometimes you fall into Krishna. So I fell into this. This was not conscious. This was just something I fell into. So forgiveness was the entryway. And how I became connected with forgiveness was Kosharupa Bhattahari's wife called me up one day and said, there's this amazing seminar. I have tickets for you. You can go for free. The only thing I knew of his seminar was ISKCON, which was just one class after another, one lecture after another, after another, for 3 days, and they called that a seminar. And that's what I thought a seminar was. Now, this was totally different. It completely changed the way I looked at education. But they did an exercise. It was, let's go back. They did an exercise on forgiveness. And I did that exercise, and everything changed, and I got very excited, and I thought, I should teach this to non-devotees because it'll be a big net. We can bring people in because so many people need to forgive. So I got a devotee counselor to help, and she said, no, the devotees need it. Work on the devotees first. So little did I know there was a lot of psychological processes that go into forgiving aside from understanding philosophy. And that introduced me to many things I didn't know. I read many books. I've taught it maybe 30, 40 times. I've learned every time I've taught it. So after I did this workshop, the first one that Kosharupa let me go to, he advertised the program, Train the Trainer. His name is T. Harv Eckert. At that time, he was the number 2 trainer, a training company in America. First was Tony Robbins. He was second. And at the end of the workshop, he said, we have this program called Train the Trainer. And Train the Trainer was to learn how to facilitate workshops. Those workshops go 12 hours a day for like 5 days. So how do you keep people's attention? And they're transformational, major changes that all happen within those 5 days. and I had just got a tax return for $2,900, and it just so happened. How much do you think the training cost? $2,900. I was going to use that $2,900 to build a recording studio and make my fame in recording, but Prabhupada told me you would never be famous as a singer, and so I said, okay, I'll do this. So I want to share what I learned from him. I spent $2,900, 4.5 days. We learned a lot of things, but this one thing, speak to the conditioning, made a huge difference in my teaching. Because when he said speak to the conditioning, it's that time when you give your lecture, you give your talk, and the audience comes up to you and said, you were speaking to me, weren't you? You knew what I was thinking. You're like, no, I didn't. Or if you're not speaking to the conditioning, it's that time when you're sitting in the audience looking at your watch. What are you thinking? When's it going to be over? Or this is a good time to take a nap, or a good time to check my WhatsApp. So when I started doing this, I was getting amazing results. I would give a workshop, and the first thing I would think is, okay, what is the problem that we're dealing with? So I'll give you an example. As many of you know, I teach japa workshop. So in teaching the japa workshop, I have to pinpoint what is the problem. The problem is mechanical chanting, smarta Brahman chanting. 16 rounds, I'm good to go. That's the problem. What's the remedy to that problem? Chanting is not a process only, it's a relationship. It's not a mechanical process, it's from the heart. That teaching transforms people. It took me many, many years of teaching to condense it. So when we're talking about conditioning, then I began thinking, okay, teaching to the conditioning. So I started after this attending more workshops. I ended up attending about 7 self-development workshops, spent about $10,000, and spent maybe 5 years just practically reading only books on psychology and self-development until I went crazy and I thought, okay, now I know enough. And so I began incorporating that in my teachings, trying to contextualize it within Vaishnava philosophy. And I was very visible on the internet, and I started getting people writing me for counseling because they thought I was a psychologist, because I was kind of talking like one. And so I started to understand the conditioning because people were telling me. And any of you who are counselors know this. The counselors know what's going on better. They know what's going on in this movement better than anyone because they know exactly what's going on in their hearts. People would write me, "Dear Prabhu, I think you're the right person. I can't tell this to my guru. I can't tell this to my temple president. I can't tell this to the ashram leader. I can't tell this to my wife. Somehow or other, I feel like you'll understand." So that's what was happening. So what I thought we could do, at least to begin, was just to go through what is this conditioning that we need to address in 2020 with the people both who are preaching to outside, but the people who are coming inside. What's going on inside? Because if we don't understand that, then when we give class, it's like way, way out of the ballpark. So, for example, sometimes I know the audience and someone's giving class and I know that Prabhu only chants 4 rounds. He's only following 3 principles. This person hasn't been to Mangal Artik in the last yuga. And the kata is it's way up there. And I'm sitting there thinking, this kata is sweet, but it's not solving the problem because you're not speaking to the need. So, what is the conditioning we're speaking to? Now, this is just, from my experience, it's a partial list. I'm sure most of you understand this, but it's good to reinforce it, and there may be things you're not aware of. Lack of good marriage skills, bad parental role models, strong brahmachari samskars. What's wrong with that? Everything's wrong with that when you get married. It's the wrong samskar unless you change. Unhealed wounds from a dysfunctional upbringing resulting in various emotional and psychological problems, extremely common. Unhealed wounds resulting from verbal, physical, or sexual abuse, resulting in traumas. How do I know this? These are just letters, people, or personal consultation. They tell me these things. This is not from books. This is what people tell me. This is what I counsel. Low self-esteem. This is epidemic in the world and in ISKCON. Stubborn, inflexible people, need to be right people. You know any people like that? Do you ever have an argument with them? What's the goal of their argument? To find the truth or prove that you're wrong? Yeah, prove you're wrong. Prove they're right. Irresponsible, emotional immaturity. Okay, I have some bad news for you. I don't know if you know this, but when your adult body gets past the age of 8, it keeps growing, right? Your emotional maturity stops about then. And if you don't cultivate it, you're an adult, but you actually have the emotional maturity of an 8-year-old. How many have you ever seen adults acting like kids? How many of you have ever acted like a kid? Big argument, you run in the room, lock the door, don't talk to me. That's what's happening. From the new bhakta all the way up, it's happening. We're in denial or unaware of personal traumas, wounds, or conditioning. We don't know how we're conditioned. We're deny that we're conditioned in certain ways. Inability to be introspective, acknowledge one's faults. Resentment, big one. How many of you have ever had resentment in your life? Raise your hand. Okay. And most of us. That is so interesting, isn't it? We're all devotees. How many of you believe in karma? How can you have resentment if you believe in karma? Isn't that interesting? We'll talk more about that. It's such an interesting topic. I thought everything happens as a result of our karma, so there's no one to blame. You're supposed to actually feel you deserve worse, right? So how could you have resentment? Very interesting. Trying to meet needs in unhealthy ways, dysfunctional coping mechanisms. This is a big problem with relationships. Weak willpower, lack of self-control, lack of relational skills, anger issues. So, the point of this is that when somebody joins ISKCON, they have some of these, some have all of them. Yes? And how many classes have you heard that address these? Have you heard any? Of course, you could say, well, Bhagavatam is not meant to address this. But that's another issue. But the fact is, these exist. And when they don't get addressed, what happens? I'm going to give you some amazing examples of what happens. Hold on. Okay. Who are we preaching to today? So here's, if you're not familiar with baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, or Gen Z, the ages are here on the right. And so we're going to describe the kind of people that are joining ISKCON. And this is not a full description, but just to give us some awareness. Half the kids in the US and many countries have divorced parents. There's problems when you come from a divorced family, and we're going to discuss those. Kids, many kids come from dysfunctional families, alcoholic fathers, abusive, drug addict mothers, abusive parents, parents that have no parenting skill, irresponsible, and so forth. In some countries, this is what one of my godbrothers who preaches in South America told me. This is not a statistic I can verify, but he said, I believe, or as far as I can tell, 1/3 of my female disciples have been raped by a family member. And I don't want to tell you what countries those are, but it exists. Hare Krishna. 80% of college students have abused alcohol. 50% have already used illicit drugs when in high school. Between 1993 and 2005, the proportion of students who abused tranquilizers like, I can't pronounce them, Anax and Valium increased 450%. 3 out of 4 American teens own an iPhone. Someone named them Generation I. And are addicted to it. So I'm sure many of you know about the problems with phone addiction. So it's just to let you know that most teens have phones. 3/4 of college kids have sex outside of marriage. 12% of millennials have anxiety disorder. 1/3 of Americans develop anxiety disorder at some point. Here's some scary figures. 20% of Americans are diagnosed with depression. 1 out of 5 contemplate suicide. 1 out of 10 attempt it. It's the second leading cause of death for people 15 to 34 years of age. That means 1 out of 5 people that we're preaching to are thinking about suicide. You have 100 people, 10 thought about, 10 actually tried it. And the reason they're still here, it's probably because they're women, because women chicken out. Most of the successful suicide attempts are men. So these things are pervasive, okay. And a whole laundry list of lifetimes of samskars. So people who are coming are very damaged. And I became very concerned because I studied psychology enough that sometimes within 5 minutes I could tell what the problem was. Like the girl who said, I'm never going to get married, I don't like men, blah, blah, blah. She was probably sexually abused or abused in some way by a boyfriend. It's just so I started understanding these things. And became more concerned, and then I decided, well, as a service, I would address these issues. So let's just get a deeper look at what these people are like that we're preaching to, the state that they're in as a result. What's the effect of divorce on children? Anxiety, constant stress, mood swings and irritability, intense sadness, behavior and social problems, trouble with relationships, prone to substance abuse, depression, effects of illicit sex. 75% of young people, teenagers, have engaged in illicit sex. So what happens when you engage in illicit sex? It's really hard to be chaste to one person. Have we seen that? Of course. Cheating on spouses. You have your office spouse, you have your spouse at home, you have your girlfriend. Challenge to remain celibate. Have we seen that? Of course. Demanding sex from one's spouse, pornography addiction, undue attraction or aversion to women, shame and guilt. Is this big or is this big? Is there shame and guilt in ISKCON? Yes or yes? Is there a lot of it? So you're coming from a background where you grew up on sex and pornography and now you've shaved your head and you're trying to be celibate. Okay, I have to tell you this story. Can I tell you? It's a beautiful story. This devotee went to a Chinese medicine doctor. Oh, time's up already, huh? We started late, right? Who's Chinese medicine doctor, and he was a Buddhist. And so they have to profile you, and he said, so what are your sexual behaviors or habits? He said, I'm celibate. And the first thing the Buddhist doctor said, who's your mentor? And he said, I don't have one. And he said, then you can't be celibate. You're lying to me. So immediately, we're putting people in a situation where we're saying, you should be celibate. How much support is there? Okay, it's time to talk about something we never talk about. What percentage of the brahmacharis in ISKCON do you think are celibate? Okay, you don't have to answer. It's not 100%. You want to take a guess? This includes looking at pornography, etc., etc. 30%, and so we have 70% neglected with no support, other than just chant your rounds and hope you make it, Prabhu. Yeah. So these are the kind of problems that really struck me, and I think these problems exist that we're not addressing because we're not looking at the conditioning. We're somehow or other afraid to look at it. I've done workshops with brahmacharis in India where we opened up and I got to see the problems are huge. Okay. Whoops. So I think you all know about cell phone addiction, right? How it creates all kinds of problems. Because we're late, I want to get more towards the end. But so what I did here is I just went through different problems and the consequences of those problems. I think you all know the traumas of sexual abuse if you can read fast. Anyway, many people come to our movement who've been sexually abused. Or verbally abused. They're traumatized, their self-esteem is very low, etc., etc. The point is, I have to get to the right slide. I've never spoken for 15 minutes before. We just did a 4-day retreat, 8 hours a day, so this is like way out of my comfort zone. I have to get to the slide. Okay, so when we have these kinds of problems, we might say, well, what does that have to do with bhakti? 2 minutes. What does that have to do with bhakti? So this is what I've seen. When people have these emotional problems, it's affecting their bhakti in so many ways. They're blaming, they're vying for Guru's attention, competing with disciples, they're disturbing other devotees, they're in need of help and sympathy. They become apathetic because they have low self-esteem, they lack confidence. Then they become arrogant to compensate for low self-esteem. Arrogance is a compensation. Then they have to be perfect or they're useless. They don't feel they deserve to do services they want and so forth. So, this is the problem. Now, this is controversial, but at least it'll wake you up. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Okay, I know this is controversial, and I don't mean this as an absolute statement, but what I have seen, knowing these problems and knowing how these problems are healed, many, many times, what are we doing? Can everyone say this together? We're throwing slokas at psychological problems. So we're giving philosophy to a problem that can't be healed by philosophy. It needs to be, philosophy is necessary, but there are many problems that philosophy doesn't heal. And because I understand these psychological processes and how they're healed, oftentimes I sit and hear philosophy being thrown at these problems. Sometimes philosophy makes you feel worse because, Prabhu, you say, I feel bad. You shouldn't feel bad. That's not Krishna consciousness. Right? Or I feel this. Doesn't matter how you feel. That's not important. I teach a course on humility, and I realized that if someone has low self-esteem, they probably shouldn't take the course because the course is all about finding out your faults, and that's all they do every day. So it just makes them feel worse because they've seen them all the time. Isn't that interesting? You could actually be preaching philosophy and unknowingly harming people. Did you know that? You ever thought of that? Yeah, I've seen it. It's very interesting. Okay, so this is what I realized. We need to put our philosophy into practical steps to deal with issues like these and take it from theory into practice. So this is the first thing I did with forgiveness, is I realized we needed a step-by-step process because although it's there in our philosophy, most devotees don't know how to do it. So I created 33 steps. It's online now, 33 videos, 100 pages of materials. And it worked. People would come at the end of 2 days, they would let it go. A lot of people were coming with issues they had when they were kids, and now they're adults, and 40 years later, they're letting it go because there's a process. Not because they didn't know they're supposed to forgive, they just didn't know how to do it. So I thought, okay, let me make that my service, develop processes. I have a course. I'll show you all the courses I have. We need to create a vulnerable atmosphere in our classes, workshops, and retreats where devotees feel safe to open up. Funny story. We're in a workshop. There's a second generation. His father was an alcoholic, in and out of ISKCON. He was living in vans and hotels. He had a horrible, horrible upbringing. If you talk to him, he would just say, Prabhu, I'm totally messed up. So we had a workshop, completely vulnerable, everything on the table, everything confidential, let out what's in your heart. You need to talk about it, as they say, whatever, if it stays in the heart, it just, you need sunshine. What is it saying? If you keep it inside, your problems grow in the dark. So all the adults they're coming out being totally honest, this problem, that problem. All of a sudden he starts laughing. So we said, what's going on? He said, you guys are more messed up than I am. That made him quite happy. So we just did a workshop, retreat a week or two ago, and it was amazing because we let everybody speak what they needed to speak without judgment. And it was amazing because people could talk about their stuff. And that is extremely important in our education, at least from my experience. Okay, the last thing, for many of the problems mentioned, we'll need to better understand psychological and emotional components of those issues to effectively solve those problems. And if you can't understand the psychological components, or you think there's one but you don't understand, find someone who does. And I just wanted to give a couple examples, because I think this will be amazing for you. So this girl comes to me and says, during Rath Yatra, I wasn't finishing my rounds. Can you help me understand this? And I asked her a question which none of you would think is the question you ask to somebody who's not chanting their rounds. I said, did you grow up with abusive parents? That was my question to, how can you help me chant better rounds? I said, did you grow up with abusive parents? She said, yes. I said, that's why you didn't finish your rounds. Because I said, do you have a problem with self-love? She said, yeah. I said, that's why you didn't finish your rounds. Lights went off. She said, you're right. The connection of chanting japa to self-love. Why would I care to chant? My parents didn't care about me. I don't care about myself. But what does it matter if I go to hell? Pervasive problem in ISKCON. See how connected this is to our spiritual life? Extremely connected. Another story. Amazing story. Do we have time for amazing story? He doesn't care. Okay. So, this girl comes to a forgiveness workshop twice. After the second workshop, she still hasn't forgiven, which is extremely rare. Usually everyone does it the first workshop. So we're talking. It took us 2 hours, and I finally caught up onto something. She had a huge issue with her ashram leader, and we couldn't figure out why. We finally understood. Her mother was tormented by her father because her father lived in Dubai. They lived in India. He neglected her mother. Her mother was in pain all the time. The ashram leader reminded her of her father who was abusing her mother, and she hated the ashram leader. How obvious is that? Obviously not obvious. Okay. Yeah. All right. I just wanted 1 minute.
Prabhu, we have to take some questions also.
I just have to read one thing.
Sure.
Can I read one thing? Okay. This is about alignment. So this is something that I find is so important. Devotees don't realize that they're out of alignment. They think they're Krishna conscious when they're not. So in America, there was a school, Amish community, there was a shooting. The crazy guy came out with a gun, kicked all the men out, lined up 10 girls, 6 died. That evening, the parents of 3 of the girls went to the home. The guy killed himself. They went to the home, and they said, we forgive you, and you can live in our community. I've done 30-plus workshops. I've asked every devotee, would we do that in ISKCON? Only one person out of those 30 workshops raised his hand. And you know why he raised his hand? Because he didn't understand the question. Nobody raised their hand. So I just want to read this. This is, please forgive me, but it's worth it. So right after this happened, Washington Cathedral, huge church in America, this was the sermon. Do you remember how remarkable it was that the Amish men and women in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, forgave the killer of their children and embraced the killer's wife? There was no indication of any deep struggle in arriving at their amazing decision. They had been preparing for that act of forgiveness for a lifetime. Listen to the last line. It's amazing. It was built into their practice as people who forgive. It wasn't a decision. It was who they had become. And I think this is really where we're lacking and where we need to go. We have to become what we believe. I have more, but I have to stop. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Thank you so much. We'll take a few questions.
Yeah. I'm just going to go to the end, because if you're interested in any of the courses I teach, which are listed here, you can just go here. And we have an online forgiveness course, which is free, and you can take it and share it. Yes?
Prabhu, can you keep the courses slide on while we have the questions?
Yeah.
So that
this is a sample. The courses that deal with issues that I feel are being neglected. Sure. Or we need more energy into these areas.
Right. So we'll take questions. Any questions? Okay. Pancharatna Prabhu.
Yes.
We our practice is meant to purify our minds. But what's going on? The minds don't seem to get clean of these things.
My realization is we come with a lot of baggage, and that's tamasic and rajasic baggage. And if we can't get a lot of that baggage into sattva gun, our practice of bhakti is tamasic and rajasic, so it's not having the effect we need. And so, well, just to give an example, like with that forgiveness course, we know we should forgive, but people aren't, and I just position it in a certain way with some exercises and self-reflection, and then they do it. So I think it's just kind of triggering sattva gun, which is the best place from which we can be practicing Krishna consciousness. That's my realization. And I went through what you went through, and I've gone through it with many devotees. And don't we just need to chant and won't everything be resolved? Yeah, but if you're asking that question, I guess it hasn't been resolved yet. So if we can employ other methods that help us, then we can chant better. Lord Chaitanya said, chant in a humble state of mind. How do you do that? You just joined yesterday. You have to learn some practices, ways of being, ways of thinking. That's my realization. But I see it works.
Thank you. There's another question here.
Yes.
Hare Krishna. I'm wondering, we're hearing that Kali Yuga is an ocean of faults, and we're swimming in it, so we're also a little ocean of faults. I wonder how the healing and the preaching in our process, going to the root of our problem, because all our faults as a reflection of the root cause in the heart with Krishna. Because it seems like we can have hundreds and thousands of traumas inside and will never be finished in the healing process with so much psychology, all these tools that are there. How do you see the healthy relationship between using psychology and following the process of bhakti as the ultimate healing process?
Yeah. My realization is, from what I've seen, that a lot of people can't practice bhakti in a healthy way because they have so much dysfunction inside. I mean, I know people that can't stop. We all know people who can't stop criticizing. That's low self-esteem. Blame, dysfunctional behavior, blame, they're crying out. They can't take responsibility. So many devotees have taken courses which help them become more responsible, overcome the need to criticize, blame, understanding the causes, and it's helped them tremendously. And then they're no longer offending the holy name, so now the holy name is working more. So I think there's a lot of dysfunction that's getting in the way of us being able to chant purely. So pure chanting is the solution. If there's anything you can do to help your pure chanting, why not? That's just my experience. This is not my theory. This is just what I see. Yes.
Yeah, Prabhuji, I was just thinking with this wonderful seminar you gave now. Like we were discussing you were discussing about people who had bad childhood or bad parenting and all this, and we still have this among ISKCON also we see.
Yes.
So can we do something like I feel that this kind of information, if we start giving in a capsule form to the children now itself, the work will be much lesser. And do you have some plan for that?
Yes, 100%. I have many plans, only separated by men and money and a little time. I have 34 of these workshops waiting to put online. Separated by time, men and money, but it's happening slowly. That's my mission, to find those loopholes where we're not addressing. Okay?
Thank you so much, Mahatma Prabhu.
So the forgiveness course will give you an idea, but my SoundCloud has many of these courses if you're interested in seeing how I contextualize what I've learned. And I've studied many spiritual teachers from Hinduism and from Buddhism, and just see how they do it, and taking the nectar from the poison and applying it. So you can see how I do it, and you can also give me advice if you think I can do it better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Srila
much.
Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai.